to be more intimate with you, Lord. Turning away.
I think I was in 3rd grade when one of my friends, I would go over to her house and her father began molesting me. I would equal the abuse that I suffered sexually to the abuse that I suffered relationally with my parents. It was my 9th grade year of high school. Remember many of times in that year, 8th grade, 9th grade, thinking, my life is horrible. That I was loved by a man named Jesus, no matter what I did and no matter what household I came from. And for a little girl that was full of shame, that was an impacting sentence.
Welcome to Pure Passion. My name is Colette Burque. It almost goes without saying, child sexual abuse is a horrendous thing. When a child is sexually abused, strongholds of thought get established in that child's mind and heart that can last a lifetime and be very difficult to ferret out from the locked chambers of the soul. Our guest today is Tracey Bickle, a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and parental neglect, who has discovered an amazing level of healing by sitting at the feet of Jesus Christ and learning the secrets of the deep heart from Him. God has given Tracey profound insight into not only the consequences of abuse and neglect, but the healing path that God wants to provide all of us that will lead us out of our dark places and into His marvelous light.
My earliest memories of my childhood is that I grew up in a very fun family. We were jammed in there. My mother had 6 children in 5 years, and then 3 years later had my little sister. I was 6th of those 7. So my earliest memories is that everything we did, we sort of did as a pack. And I loved my family. I remember thinking that. I remember thinking we lived in a fun household. Little did I realize that my household was quite filled with trauma. My father was an Olympic athlete who failed to attain his goal of a gold medal, and thus that sort of tainted the rest of his life. He came back from the Olympics and became a professional boxer, quite successful in his own right. But back then, sports didn't quite pay the finances that it does today. And so what he did is he became a house painter. We would have been considered low income and thus lived in a very low income white neighborhood. And my parents would have been quite overwhelmed financially. And my mom began working while I was in, I believe, kindergarten, joining my father in the painting world of houses. So that was quite stressful for her. And so I remember being babysat and parented by the older siblings, which were all of 2 and 3 years older than me. I don't know if most of you have older siblings that you were parented by, but they're not the best parents. And so what set in early was a vulnerability in my life that called other people to come fill. And one of my friend's father, I believe at the age, I think I was in 3rd grade, when one of my friends, I would go over to her house and her father began molesting me. And I remember telling no one. I remember being quite scared. I remember thinking something's wrong with this. And yet instinctively knowing that bringing that back to my family and my parents, it would have overwhelmed them even more. And so I told no one. My father and my mother at that point were both alcoholics, and there was a lot of trauma going on within our household, a lot of violence and a lot of just chaos. My parents were both completely ungodly and no pretense of church. So my relationship with the Lord, I would have had none in my life at that point. I actually encountered the Lord and got saved at the age of maybe 11. So that was just after my abuse, that I had an older brother who met the Lord, encountered him, and then came and asked the family, sort of introduced the family to Jesus. And no one said yes, I believe, at that point, except for myself. I think maybe some of my other siblings did off and on, but there was so much trauma in my household that some of it didn't take hold. When I look back on my, on the way in which I internalized the abuse and the way in which I internalized the trauma in my household, as an adult, I can look back and see that the trauma in my household wasn't just that my parents were both alcoholics, wasn't just that we had no financial means to maintain a stable food lifestyle, a stable clothing lifestyle, a stable utilities lifestyle, but that actually parentally, my parents would have completely neglected me in their inability to have any significant tools of which to navigate such a large family. And so looking back as an adult, I would say that the effect on that would be that I completely dissociated from my world. And I began living in a fantasy world. I call it living on the ceiling. And so I lived on the ceiling of my reality, and I created a completely alternate reality in my mind's eye, in my imagination. Even as a saved young girl, I just remember thinking that was my out. I would go to sleep with my sort of different set of parents. As I grew into my teens and grew into my high school years, I remember loving the Waltons, and as a TV family, really sort of internalizing that as my family, and sort of just longing for that good night, John Boy, good night, Mary Ellen, and thinking, wouldn't that be lovely if that was my family? And I would never have connected as a young child or even a young adult. I probably didn't connect till I was close to my 30s that I lived dissociative and that I lived not remembering. Even my young adulthood, I don't remember much because I lived so separate from my reality as a way of escape and really my tool of which to deal with the pain, and which I know that many of us create tools and outlets of which to deal with childhood pain and trauma. And that would have been the way that I dealt with mine. And so I lived separate. And it really wasn't until I began getting help myself. Now, I remember thinking, my siblings all need help. I remember thinking, my siblings all have some problems, and encouraging them to go get help, but I was fine because I actually didn't act out as a young adult. I didn't act out as a preteen or a teenager because I loved Jesus. And so therefore, I remember really believing that my childhood neglect, my childhood watching trauma and violence, my childhood of parents that had addictions had no effect on me because I didn't act out. I had other siblings that acted out in multiple ways that were just painful and traumatic, and just thinking they need help and let me help them. But really believing I didn't act out. But my acting out was that I lived separate from my internal world. What I mean by living separate, what I mean by dissociative, what I mean by what I call living on the ceiling, I would have, no one ever defined to me what dissociative was. And of course, dissociative can be on a continuum, can't it? It can be from us driving to Walmart and not remembering how we got there because our mind was somewhere else. That would be really sort of low level, and many of us sort of do that, all the way to people creating alternate personalities. I would venture to say that I lived somewhere in the middle. And, but it was it's really the amazing ability that we have as human beings to live through trauma. And what we have is an ability within our minds to separate ourselves from the events, from the traumatic events. And when I start listing as an adult some of the childhood events that I lived through, I think, well, sure, no wonder you lived on the ceiling. One of those is inordinate, let alone 10 of them, right? And so I lived in a fantasy world that my world was always happy, that my family was not who it was. It wasn't sort of a fantasy world under orgasm. It wasn't like I lived a sexual fantasy. It was that I just lived in a fantasy that what I was experiencing was not happening. And I find it brilliant that our minds can do that. And I also find it brilliant that our minds cannot let ourselves know that we're doing it. It's sort of instinctive. But as adults, we get to choose when we hear that to sort of relate that to ourselves and how are we living in the present. My body was not a safe place to live. And so I didn't live there. I lived slightly up here. And when I began understanding that that's how I lived, I had to invite myself really back into my body. I had to say to myself, Tracey, life is okay. You're not the young child. You're not in trauma any longer, but you're here and this is your life in this room with, chairs and a table, and life is okay. And you've got control over it. So I can live present. And I had to start doing that. Literally for me, it was a minute by minute reality. And I would even chatting with people, even pastoring people. I was a pastor's wife for 8 years before I knew I lived dissociative. And I thought that I was just a good pragmatic person. And I was just someone who wasn't hyper emotional, when in reality, I was separate from my emotions and I didn't let myself feel emotions. My abuse was actually about oral sex. And so I remember I remember it affecting me with intimacy with my husband. I didn't act out prior to marriage. And so, but I would have never connected that I probably didn't act out primarily because of my fear, not necessarily because of my moral values, even though I would have heralded myself as someone with high moral values. But when I started walking through my pain, I realized it was more about my fear, and which I appreciate at some level because it kept me in that moral yard, if you will. And I didn't cross boundaries. But looking back, I realized it really had more to do with the fact that I was repulsed by male organs. And so in that way, it did have an effect on my marriage, and it did have an effect on my intimacy with my husband, which is why I ended up getting help at the age of 30. I'd heard of a program called Living Waters. A gentleman named Andy Comiskey ran a ministry called Desert Stream, and it offered a program for those dealing with sexual and relational brokenness. And for me, that's what happened. And so when I look back at my childhood and I look back at the abuse that I suffered, and really I would equal the abuse that I suffered sexually to the abuse that I suffered relationally with my parents, which would be abject neglect. My mom was a completely overwhelmed mother. She had zero tools of which to navigate 7 children, let alone one, or one child, let alone 7. And so that left a void in me as a little girl. I remember being a dirty little girl, unkept, not dirty like perverted, but unkept, unclean, unbathed. And that is really a telltale sign for predators, honestly, for predators. They spot those things in little children. And it left me vulnerable to yielding to those who would pay any attention to me at all. And so for me, the neglect that arched over my life as a young child growing up was the pool of which predators could come dip in. And it left me rejected. It left me needing affirmation. It left me needing love. It left quite a big vacuum in myself in which others could come and fill easily. And I would say yes to, thinking I was going to have that vacuum filled when in essence, when in reality, that's not what happened. What happened would be more abuse and more rejection and more shame and more taking in, I must be bad, and taking in something's wrong with Tracey, or my parents would have 1, 2, 3. My dad would have 1, 2, 3. The abusers wouldn't have, I wouldn't be marked. And I think that my neglect actually preceded significantly my sexual abuse. And it marked me all along the way of me growing up. And I think that childhood neglect is a silent abuse because it's hard to put your finger on. I could say, I see this man's penis coming at me, that's horrible. But I couldn't say something's wrong with my parents' love towards me because you couldn't see the fact that I wasn't getting hygiene taught to me appropriately. I wasn't having food on a regular basis given to me in a consistent manner. I wasn't having clothing given to me in a consistent manner. And those things are unseen, and it's hard to put your finger on what's not there, which is neglect. Neglect is not there. And so that was harder for me to connect with than my sexual abuse. But that was actually the key to me getting healing. And yet it was tied into the fact that I loved my mom. And it was tied into the fact that I know that my mom loved me. My mother's no longer with us. And I like to say that I was my mom's favorite because my siblings can't quite argue with me. She's not here. And so I had a great relationship with my mom as a young adult. And I knew that she loved me. And so the idea that somehow I was going to point my finger at a mom that I was cognizant was already overwhelmed in life. She already was married to an alcoholic. She already didn't have enough to sustain her life, let alone the life of her children. So then why was I going to point my finger at her and go, you did this to me? That was a challenge for me because I thought, I can't do that. I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to point to my mom, like, leave her alone. She's already tired. But when I realized that I could say that my mom loved me, but she didn't have the tools of which to show it to me. She didn't have the tools of which to raise me. When I could actually say that, then I thought, I can do that. I can say that I had legitimate needs that my mom wasn't able to fill, but that she loved me. Then that could connect with my heart. And when I did that, then I was able to let the Lord come in and look and touch at some of those extremely painful areas as a little girl that didn't have her needs met emotionally, didn't have her needs met physically, and didn't have her needs met spiritually on any level. And when I was able to do that, then it allowed him in to touch those areas, and I could offer to him my pain before the cross. I remember at the age of 10, my older brother of 4 years, was introduced to Jesus by his high school football coach. And he came home and told the rest of the family. And I remember saying yes, I think primarily at 10 because I wanted love from my brother. I wasn't getting it from my father. And so it wasn't sort of this altruistic, I saw my sin at the age of 10. That sounded good to me. And if he was going to say yes, I was going to follow him. And so I did. And what transpired was being connected with Young Life, which was an amazing program for young children. Because what it taught for me was not that I had to do this, and this to be loved or saved, but that he just loved us. And that I was loved by a man named Jesus, no matter what I did and no matter what household I came from. And for a little girl that was full of shame, that was an impacting sentence. And that was an impacting reality. And so as I grew older, not much, at the age of 14, I had a brother who broke his neck playing football and became a quadriplegic. And in that same year, my father passed away suddenly, which created more trauma. Both of those events were traumatic in and of themselves. But together, it destroyed what little bit of family unit we had. And then my mom was really left to, I can't even imagine a 36-year-old woman left to taking care of a quad and taking care of family with no way or means of which to supply their financial need. And so at that point at 14, I was saying yes to the Lord in a significant way, in a very overt way, and understanding on a larger scale that God would meet my emotional need. And yet again, it wasn't for me because I was in an unsaved family, which I today am thankful for. It wasn't a Christian home, which said if you did this, or a religious home that said you had to attain these things for God to say yes to you. It was a completely godless home. And that for me was actually freedom because he just loved me. He just loved me. And I loved that. And I remember thinking I could just have a conversation with him and he would listen to me. And I remember many a times in that, it was my 9th grade year of high school. Remember many of times in that year, 8th grade, 9th grade, thinking, my life is horrible. And if this is life, I mean, I'm starting off on a really low scale. And yet the Lord met me and he showed me that he loved me. And it was more about a relationship with this man than a performance with this man. And so I think that marked me in my early Christian life, that I could not have much understanding of the wherefores and how comes of what Christianity was, and have an understanding that there was a man named Jesus that loved me if I gave my whole heart. Not even if I gave my whole heart, but that allowed me to give my whole heart to him. When I look at my childhood and I look at the relationship that I had with Jesus as a 14-year-old, I remember thinking then, I want to marry a man that didn't cuss or drink. That was my sort of high aspirations. And I remember thinking, I want to marry a pastor. That I just remember thinking that, and even chatting with my mom and chatting with her best friend that I was going to marry a guy who didn't cuss and didn't drink, and them sort of patting me on the head and thinking, isn't she sweet? And I think I mentioned that I grew up in a low-income family, and low-income families are not notorious for chatting about college around the dinner table. We chatted about what union we were going to join, or what trade we were going to get. And my father would have been a little bit of an Archie Bunker. That for some of you who would watch Nick at Night today, gives you context for my father's framework and view of family, which is women support men. And so in 9th grade, I became a cheerleader, and which cheerleaders just cheer the men on, don't we? And that was my role, and I loved it. I mean, I loved my life. I just remember thinking I loved my life. Not that I actually experienced much of it because I was living on the ceiling, but I remember loving my life and loving the Lord and loving Young Life, and a gentleman named Bob Leyleitner who headed up the Young Life program under Colonial Presbyterian about 40 years ago. And that was my safe haven. And he really impacted my world and impacted that I could be all that I wanted to be. And yet what I wanted to be was a mom and a wife. And so out of high school, I moved in with my 2 brothers. I had 2 brothers, the one that introduced me to the Lord and the one that broke his neck. And one took care of the other. And I remember out of high school moving in with them and taking care of my brother, Pat, for about a year. And in that time, I met my future husband. His name was Bob. And I was married at the age of 19. At the age of 22, we were helping pastor a church here in Kansas City called Kansas City Fellowship back in 1983. And so I was living my dream. I mean, not just my fantasy world, but actually my dream world. And it became real, and I loved my life. And I had, the 2.3 children. I had a young boy and a young girl. And then about 6 years later, we adopted a young boy and from a mom who was a crack addict. And so I had 3 children, and I was living life and loving it, still very disconnected from my own heart, because I lived sort of out here. Though I threw myself into pastoring, into helping, into loving people. Well, I loved people. I do that. I knew I loved people, and I knew that I loved giving love to people. Ultimately, what would happen in that world was I would get my own internal needs met by loving people, unbeknownst to myself that at some level I was feeding off of those people, which is slightly discouraging me today because I realized how much I fed off the sheep. But in it, knowing that God is faithful and He's kind, and I recognize that. And I even remember going back to some of them and apologizing. But knowing that I just love to help people. And so when I ran into a ministry called Desert Stream, it was doing a program called Living Waters. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, they help those that deal with sexual brokenness. And for me, growing up in the Midwest, you didn't go to counseling. Back in the 80s, you didn't seek help. I mean, I remember mentioning that my siblings all needed it, but it hadn't really had its impact on me. But when I ran into this program, I thought, I need help. My husband agreed with me openly that I need help dealing with my sexual abuse. And I thought, I'm just going to take it for that. It's going to be fabulous. And I took it, and I remember loving it, and remember it really impacting the areas of my heart that no one had ever touched. And again, what it did was it showed me my childhood neglect, which was the dilemma of which I had to open up to and sort of had to see. And once I did that, then I was able to let the Lord into areas that I hadn't ever before. And I call it removing all that hinders love.